All right, so let's start talking about the contents. Now, this course is about JavaScript. Now, the name of the course is Fundamental Scripting Language. But the scripting language that particularly we're talking about here is JavaScript. Okay. Now, JavaScript, when it first emerged, it was emerged as a client-based web scripting language. It has evolved into something else now. We're gonna introduce the concept of web applications just to introduce the concept or the context in which the JavaScript was introduced. But the course is not focused on web applications. Okay, the course is focused on the fundamentals of the language itself. All right, but we're gonna introduce the concept of web applications just to understand the context. All right. All right. So for the sake of contrast, I would like to talk about the desktop applications. Now, web applications is very different than desktop applications. Okay, a desktop application is an application that you need to install on your own machine, on every single machine, the application itself. Okay, an example of that is the Microsoft Word that you probably already know. Microsoft Office, for example, the version that you install in your on your computer is a desktop application, right? So if you have an office of 100 employees and you want them to use Microsoft Office, you're gonna need to install Office 100 times, right? Now, in contrast, the web version of the web application, you don't need 100 installation. You need the application installed in one machine that is called the server. And then you need to install a client on every single machine. The client is like a thin, lightweight application that can access that server. Okay, so you can see here, when we say server, we refer to two things. The word server can be used to refer to the machine itself, okay, that hosts the server, or sometimes it refers to the software that is installed in that machine that makes it work as a server. Okay, now oftentimes we draw it as a machine like this, but in order for the machine to act as a server, it needs a software that is the server software, right? Okay, so once we have this application installed on top of the server software, a thin software called a client, for example, the web browser like Chrome or Microsoft Edge is a client software that knows how to connect to the server in order to access the application. All right. So an example of that, to contrast it to the desktop application that we talked about, is the web version of Microsoft Office. You also have access to it through a website. Okay, it is very similar, even though with some limitations. If you tried both versions of Office, you will notice that the web version has some limitations, right? But the fact that it is very easy to install, that's just one installation and everybody have access to that installation, made that web application very popular, even though it can be limited sometimes, but it made it very, very popular all over the world. Okay, now when you have something that's popular, now everybody wants to create their own server software or their own client software. Okay, but with the popularity and everybody wants to use everybody else's application, we needed some sort of a standard. Okay, so the standards like HTML standard was introduced to unify the way the documents are formatted. Okay, so at the beginning of web application, it was just about document sharing, just text. At the very beginning, before HTML, it was just text. Okay, and then they said, okay, we want to format this text to make it more readable. So they created this HTML to have a standard way to format the text. And then there's another type of standard to communicate between the server and the client. And that's what we call the HTTP standard, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So the hypertext is just a text highlighted with formatting information. The Hypertext Transfer Protocol is just a set of rules that the client and server need to follow in order to be able to communicate with each other. So now anyone can create a web application as long as it follows the standard. Anyone else can work with it. Okay, web server or web clients, you have different companies or different groups create their own versions of the servers and the clients, but as long as it really follows the standard, there's no problem with communication. All right. Now, how does that communication work? So a client like the web browser knows how to create a request, and the server receives that request and knows how to create a response. And how do they make sure that the requests and the response are well understood? When they follow the protocol. So a request that follows the HTTP protocol is called HTTP request. And the response that follows the HTTP protocol is called HTTP response. Okay? Now, there are several steps, actually, and if we look more closely into the details, let me just move this out of the way. Okay. So we start with a user opens a browser and wants to see a certain page that is stored somewhere on the web, on some server. Okay, so the user would identify or indicate the resource that they want to see by either clicking on a link or typing the address in the address bar of the browser. Now, the browser, the client's job, first job of the client, is to know how to receive the requested or the needed resource from the user. So let's say the address bar, for example, is one mechanism. The link or a hyperlink is another mechanism for the user to tell the browser that I want to see this page or this image or any resource. Okay? Now, the browser takes that from the user and create the HTTP request. Okay, so add the additional information that are indicated by the HTTP protocol, and then send that request to the server. So the client needs to know how to create the request, and it needs to know how to send it to the server. All right, and then the server needs to have a mechanism to receive that request and read it. And then it looks for the resource that was requested in the set of resources that are stored in that server. All right, once it finds it, it creates the HTTP response around it, and then send it to the client. All right, now the client needs also to have a mechanism to receive the HTTP response that include HTML code. And then the final step or the final task of the client is to display that. Now we're going to talk about HTML in more details, but it's the user is not supposed to see the code of the HTML. It's supposed to the browser interpret the code and represent it to the user. Okay. So that is the final task, is to present the final form or the formatted version of the requested resource on the body of the page, or so that the user can see. Okay. Now, when we talk about requests, there are specific types that the HTTP protocol specifies set of types that a browser can send requests, or methods, sometimes they call it. Okay, the most popular ones are GET and POST. Okay, so for the GET request, for example, this is an example GET request. It looks like this. It has a header, a request line that indicates the method, and then information about the requested resource and any information sent by the user to the server. Okay, so the GET request is kind of like a postcard. Okay, when you send a postcard, you put all the information like open like that. Anyone who sees the postcard can see all the information you're sending. Okay, the other popular type of request is called the POST request. Has an additional component that's called the body, as you can see here. Okay, so it looks very much like the GET request. It has a line with the address or the path of the requested resource, but the information sent by the user are not open like that. They are sent in a more secure way inside the body of the request. So sending a POST request is like sending a letter in an envelope. Okay, so you put the address and some information outside on the envelope, so these can be seen. But the actual information, the actual letter is inside the envelope, so nobody can see. So it's more secure. So if you're sending password or credit card information or something like that, you're gonna have to send it with POST request, and it can only be seen on the server. Okay, but if you have some information like color preferences or something that doesn't have any security issues with it, you can send it as a GET. Okay. Now that's for the request. So there are some different types of requests when you send a request, but when the server sends a response, regardless of the type of the request, the response is gonna always be the same. It has to be HTTP response, so it has some header and additional information required by the protocol. But in addition to that, it has some HTML content. So this is the whole idea. So this is what we actually wanted to send anyways. Okay, but just what surrounds it is just the protocol information and how to find the client that actually requested it and stuff like that. Okay, now once the request is received, or the response is received by the browser, now the final task of the browser is to look at the code inside the HTML that was sent in the response and interpret it. So for example, if you look in the code, you will see that something like this, a tag that specifies an image. No, the user doesn't need to see that. The user needs to see the actual image. Okay, so that is the final task of the browser. Okay, so this is how web applications generally work. All right, now we're gonna talk about how JavaScript came to be known. Any questions so far? Any questions so far? Okay.